Hi, good evening. My name's Karteek. That's all working. Thanks very much for joining this evening. Thanks also to Ron and Bakam for suggesting doing these events further, doing them again. I think it's a great idea. Um, so I'm planning to chat fairly briefly about how meditation has helped me with ultras. And I think it would be great at the end to have a bit of time for some comments and perhaps some questions as well. So I was going to suggest, just as I'm talking, just type away and ask anything or make any comments you want now. And then hopefully at the end, there'll be some time to take a look. Okay, so what is meditation? Where do we start here? Um, there's all sorts of branches, all sorts of strands of meditation. Broadly speaking, they all seem to refer to a fairly similar process, which is about trying to quieten and still the restless, busy mind, and to help train ourselves to enter into part of ourselves, which is that bit quieter, stiller, deeper, and more solid. So typically in classes and things, one would tell people to imagine a tree which is blowing away in the wind with all the leaves and branches flying everywhere. And meanwhile, the trunk stays solid and roots you into the ground and allows the life energy to flow up through it. I've been studying meditation for quite a long time with the Indian spiritual teacher Sri Chinmoy, who was he was from the East originally and then was based in the West in New York for many years of his life. So his approach regarding meditation was what he called the heart center. So he always used to say, no mind, only the heart. And that's really the sort of approach that I've taken to meditation. And as I say, it's very, very similar to many different kind of styles of meditation, even though they have different names, they're pretty similar. So in very simple terms, the mind is, there's nothing bad about the mind particularly, but in terms of meditation, we can say that it categorizes things, it analyzes things, it's critical, hopefully in a good way, but it uses that aspect of itself as criticism, and it tends to chop reality up, if you like, into little bits and pieces and judge them and analyze them. The heart, on the other hand, is something that works more by identity. It tends to want to merge with things. It's where we would find sympathy and empathy. And rather than functioning through separativity, which is how the mind would work, the heart really wants to unite with things and become one with them in order to experience what that means. Okay, so how does that link to ultras and ultra distances? Well, for me, I think the best place to start is back with swimming. It always comes back to swimming with me. And I was lucky enough to live near a 50-meter pool. And I used to go and swim up and down this pool for long periods of time, for many years, in fact, before I was able to swim across the channel. And then I kept swimming across the channel, and I kept swimming up and down the pool as well. But this pool, 50 meters, and my first big thing was trying to swim a mile. So a mile used to take me, for sake of argument, about 28 minutes. I think I could do them quicker, and I'd be pretty happy with that nowadays. But 28 minutes was a sort of cruising pace for me, if you like. And already at that stage, the mile was more than just a rigid, determined kind of structure. It had a sort of special quality to it, which was, initially it was just the shape of it. It was 4 times 8, 4 times 8 quarter miles. And each quarter mile would take me 7 minutes or thereabouts. So sometimes I'd be counting in my head, and I think it's quite hard to switch that off to be counting the lengths in your head. But if my mind did wander, I'd always know exactly where I was just by looking at my watch, because I'd know that even if I was 5 seconds or so slower on a lap or a loop, I would never be a full 2 minutes slower. So I could look at my watch and know exactly where I was. And as I said, this mile had a very special feel for me. And quickly a mile would become 2 miles. And right there's going past the halfway point to 35 minutes, 42 minutes, 49 and 56. So those things are engraved in my mind, those numbers. And 2 miles for me also has a sort of special feel to it, a special shape. It wasn't about swimming fact, I don't even know the number, but it'd be 64 lengths if I have to do the calculation there. That quickly merged into trying to do a 3-mile swim, which again had a shape for me. It like came over the top of the clock, it came down the other side, and if I was in good shape, I could do it in about 1 hour 20. If I followed my 28-minute mile schedule, it would be about, I think it's 1:24, and I think my best was 1:15 or something. But that's not super relevant. The point I'm trying to make is that already those distances, they weren't just a sort of dry cut mechanical mental approach to the distance of being 96 lengths or 64. They had a sort of special quality to them in terms of these groups of 8, the times of 7 minutes, all sorts of different shapes with the angle of the clock that I could see. And they had a feel to them, a quality, almost like perhaps a slight color to them or a texture. And the 3-mile swim became, I wouldn't say an obsession, but almost like a sort of fixation. I also felt I had to go and do 3 miles, and that would be the best training for me. And there's no particular reason for that. It's a pretty arbitrary thing. There was no schedule. But I think looking back, it was important because it was like an individual, it was me stamping my individuality on a schedule and saying, right, 3 miles is important to me. It has a special significance. And so I go and do those 3-mile swims, and the idea was perhaps each day if I was in good shape, or perhaps every other day. And then occasionally I'd try and do 4 miles. And don't worry, I will stop at 4. I'm not going to keep going up. So 4 miles again had a sort of special structure, special shape, and it would come up the other side of the clock, getting towards 2 hours. And time would start to be going much quicker at this stage. And if I was going to my sort of regular pace, again, 1 hour 52, but I would always try and do it a little bit quicker than that. And that would lead me to another point, which I think is important, where I would never try myself personally, I would never try and combine the time with the distance. So generally in the pool, I was very much focused on distances. It was about lengths and quarter miles and exact 2 miles and 3 and 4 miles, etc. But occasionally I might say to myself, like, I want to do a 2-hour swim or a 1-hour swim. But the beauty of the 2-hour swim was that I could actually do that in 1 hour 50 or perhaps a little bit quicker if I was really motivated. So I think that's an important thing, that if you're going by time, allow yourself the luxury of a kind of incentive that you can get that 2 hours out of the way a bit quicker. So you're not cheating yourself there. I think your mind can be totally happy with that. And I would write that down as 2 hours. In fact, I was going to tell people, I'd tell them I'd done 2-hour swim, and that would be accepted by my tricky mind. So the 3-mile swim became a real sort of staple. And then if I wanted to try and then do longer, occasionally I wanted to try and do a 10K or 6 miles, all I would do, I would just convince myself that I just had to get in and do that regular 3 miles, stop, and then just do the same thing again. And somehow for me, it never felt like doing 6 miles. It was always like doing 3 miles twice, or doing 3 miles, and then having a think about it and doing another 3 miles again. So that really helped me build up being able to do distance in the pool. What then becomes more dramatic is when you have to go and swim in the cold, freezing. It's not actually that freezing, but you tell people it's freezing, the cold sea. And the first thing you have to do to swim the channel is a 6-hour swim. And of course, actually, you really need to be able to do 6 hours, 2 days running, and try and do that over 3 or 4 weekends. But the initial thing for me to try and do 6 hours was just such a huge ordeal. I could just never get my head around it, if you like. Harder than any other kind of event. And I'm sure you can sympathize. The idea of just getting in the sea at any time for 5 or 10 minutes when you're not perhaps necessarily that acclimatized can be quite difficult. And the idea of then staying in there for another 6 hours for me, just I couldn't get my head around it. So I realized I had to try and come up with a strategy. And the first thing I did was I would go down to the beach where I trained, and I would actually just start my clock before I was ready. So about 5 minutes before I got in, I would start my watch, which is the 6-hour countdown. And then I'd slowly get changed and get ready and prepare a few things and make sure no one was going to steal my things on the beach, which has happened a few times. So somehow about 5 or 10 minutes could just go by before I actually got into the sea. And as soon as I put my toe in the sea, also mentally, I'm saying, right, the whole thing starts there and then. I also developed this strategy where if it was stormy or I didn't feel like swimming, I developed these kinds of exercises I could do, which I could do actually standing in the water. But I was totally immersed, well, up to my head, and I was immersed. So I was really getting the benefits of cold water acclimatization. So if anything, it was just as difficult as swimming, if not harder. But for me, mentally, it was so much easier because I could effectively just stand there more or less on the beach near my things. And it didn't have that heavy mental pressure of going off swimming across the bay. And I used to do that sometimes for about half an hour, even for about an hour. So here I am trying to get my head around this almost impossible 6-hour swim. I've got about 10 minutes that what I think of as frauding myself. I've stolen 10 minutes just by cheating my watch, by messing around. I'm in the water. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I could actually kill an hour by doing those exercises. And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, I could also do that at the end. I could do an hour towards the end of my swim and then also mess around for another 10 minutes or so. And already I'm starting to do some mental calculations. I've got my swim down to 3.5 hours, 3 hours 40. And then once I get swimming, my actual loop was approximately half a mile out and half a mile back around this little bay. But with the way the tides worked and sometimes the weather, it would always take about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And again, I was never quite sure in my head how long it had taken because I wouldn't look at my watch. And again, I could lengthen that a little bit by what I would say is kind of messing around, if you like, at the end of each loop. But again, I'm immersed in the cold water. I'm doing what I want to do, which is to spend 6 hours in the water. I'm not worrying about distance here. And again, I think it's very key not to get concerned about that at the beginning. That'll come later. If you can achieve 6 hours or something equivalent, you'll have so much joy and enthusiasm that then further down the line, you'll be able to do the distance as well. So suddenly I'd go off and do my one loop, and in my head, I could get that to last an hour. So then I'm saying to myself, I just need to go back and do that one more time, and then actually just one more time after that. And effectively, I'm almost done. And somehow, lo and behold, I would get through these 6-hour swims. And when I say I fraud myself at the beginning, it's true. But at the end, what I do, having swum for almost 6 hours and being on top of the world because I've achieved what I wanted to do, it's very, very easy to add in another 15, 20 minutes lolling about, another little short swim. Almost a torture at the beginning, that 10 or 15 minutes, but it gives you such a mental boost or a leap or a push to do that, to sort of steal it, if you like, off yourself at the beginning, and then you give it back at the end. So you have actually officially covered the 6 hours. Okay, so that's all well and good with swimming. I'd like to consider running as well. So for the sake of argument, my running loop, which would go from my house up the road, and it goes up a bit of a hill. And let's say it's 2 miles from the beginning to the turnaround and back. It so happens where I'm living at the moment is quite remote, it's quite rural, and for sort of winter training in the evenings, I used to find the first half of it's quite well lit, and there's houses and there's people. It's quite friendly, if you like. And psychologically for me, that's much easier. I used to find didn't mind going up to the end of the loop. I'm not so scared these days. But when it's dark and it's wet and it's cold, it's psychologically more draining to be going in this sort of rather strange part. And I'd be happy going up once and back, but often I'd want to say double it to do 4 miles. So one day, all I did is when I got to the turnaround, I just came back to the 3/4 of the waypoint, then went back to the turnaround again and got that bit out of the way. I think, well, I'll just do it now while I'm here, get it out of the way. And then I went from the 3/4 of the waypoint down to the halfway point and did that and got that out of the way. So in effect, I've done half of my loop, my second loop, but I've got the difficult bit out of the way sort of in advance, if you like. And now mentally, I found I could relax because I was back sort of near home, and psychologically so much easier to run and train in that place. So that's how that started. And then actually, to be honest, my loop is 0.9. It's not 2 miles. That was just to try and explain myself, but it's 0.9. And I'm sure many of you runners will sympathize that whenever you try and measure something or you get a nice loop or distance to a very useful lamppost or gate or a loop of some kind that never really quite adds up to what you want, which would be a mile. If that was a mile, I'd be in heaven, but it's 0.9. So I have to go up there and come back, and then I have to do an extra little 0.1 of a mile out and back to get my 2 miles. And in fact, someone told me that you can always tell ultra distance runners because you see them running past their house 2 or 3 times before they stop. And I know what that is. It's because they want to get that final little tenth of a mile in so they can say they've done their 3, 5 or whatever, how many miles it is. Anyway, so I'd go up, I'd start doing these loops, and it's up a hill, and then I got a little flat bit. And again, I'd start repeating these end bits because it's up in the dark, it's cold. I like it, but it's not somewhere I want to spend longer than I can if I can avoid it. And then sometimes instead of doing the little last bit, the 0.1 of a mile at the end, if I'm doing say 2, 3, 4 miles, those start to add up and it could become half a mile or a mile. And I'll actually start doing those up the other end too. So I can come back and when I get to my door, I'm finished. So that sort of progressed more and more till it wasn't just coming back to the 3/4 of a mile point, but I would actually sometimes do the end bit and just run or walk back to a location like a gate or a lamppost or a door or something, some kind of marker. And I do that, and then I go back up to the end again, back up to the turnaround point, come back to my little marker, and I take that marker and go to another one. And somehow, by splitting this distance up into all sorts of different types, and I'd even have other little loops that I hadn't quite done yet, it really just took the pressure off my mind. And another way that was interesting on an actual loop, that would be what I was discussing was an out and back. On a loop, again, the usual thing where the loop never quite adds up to what you want. And I tend to have all these little spurs, and I'm sure people will have the same experience, like down a little path to a gate or around another little park or whatever it might be, down a road and back. And once you add all these things up, you've got your mileage. But even with some of these little spurs, if you like, I might then start applying the same principle to that. So I've got my overall round loop, which I might do twice, and then I've got these little spurs coming off it. And even on some of those spurs, I might go down to the end of one and come back halfway, go back down the end, get the rough idea. Now, it sounds silly, but it was incredible how much it does help me, because it would take me out of the sort of rigid, mechanistic, sort of disciplined idea of, well, I've got to go and run 5 miles or 10 miles, and I'm on 4 miles, and I'm on 4.5 miles, because the mind would often be very confused. I wouldn't quite know where I was, but I could sort of slowly start adding it all up. By the time I was adding things up, I'd done another mile or so. And of course, you know, if you're running with a GPS, you've got that on there anyway, so you know how far you've gone objectively, or you've got your watch with you, you've got the time when you left the house and when you got back, so you know how far you've gone. And also, I think, interesting enough, inwardly, you almost always tend to know how long you've been out for or how far you've gone, quite uncannily, I think, rather like when you wake up just before your alarm goes off. It seems we have a very powerful inner clock that we can tap into. So that's what I used to do with loops. It sounds a bit crazy, but for me, it really, really helped. And then just lastly, on a similar point, I spoke a little bit about the 10-day race in New York, which is an event I just love doing. Such an extraordinary event, and I'd love to talk more about it, perhaps on another day. But my goal was to try and get to 500 miles, which I think I mentioned last time. And that's, you know, many people have surpassed that. It's a good distance, it's a good achievement, but lots of people can do more. But for me, that I started, I got about 450, 460, and then one year I finally managed to get to 500. So coming back to loops, the loop around that park where the race was run that particular year was 0.8 of a mile. So I figured that to get my 50 miles, I had to do it was 62.5 laps, actually. So again, already there's a slight confusion for the mind, which really helps. Anyway, I knew that if I could get 62 laps, I'd be pretty happy. Some days 63. One tends to impose all sorts of little structures and plans on these things, which never seem to work. But the one that worked really well for me, or best, let's say, was to try and do 21 laps 3 times, 3 sets of 21. So I found I could wake up, and I was fairly fresh after just probably a couple of hours rest. And I could get out in the morning, I could do my 21 laps. I wouldn't say with no problem, but perhaps with less problem than other laps. The afternoon would come, and I could pretty much get through the afternoon, and then the evening would set in, and I had to do this final set of 21 laps to make up the 50 miles. And the first day or two, I was okay. But then after about 3 or 4 days, the exhaustion was setting in, and I really struggled because it would get late, it would be colder. I'd start to go over into the night. When I wanted to try and finish by midnight to get some rest, I'd start to be 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And in the end, I think one night I didn't get any sleep at all. I was getting so slow. But what I did one time is one afternoon, I had this sort of brainwave, and I did try to explain, I think, this to you last time, but hopefully I can nail it a bit better this time. Um, I would go out in the afternoon, and I'd start my afternoon laps. I'd do 3, 4, 5 of them, and then there was a specific moment where I said, right, I'm going to start doing those evening laps now. Those really difficult, tricky ones, and I'd imagine myself almost like running at night in the difficult times, except now it was the afternoon and there were people around and it was easier. And I'd do the 21st one, the 20th, and I'd count myself down till I got to about 12 or 13, let's say. And then I'd say to myself, great, this evening's laps, all I need to do is 12 laps or so before I can go and rest. And then I come back to my afternoon laps, which of course were a bit more than they would be, but it was so much easier for me then to come and do those afternoon laps, get up to 21 with this joyful feeling that I only had 12 left to do in the evening. Um, so it does sound crazy, and I think it probably is slightly crazy, and maybe it would only happen during those moments of tiredness and in that space you're in. But it got me through the race because somehow there would be this joy I felt in only having to do 12 laps in the evening, and someone would come along with their outer watch or clock and say, well, you've got the same number of laps to do. What are you talking about? And even I'd run past the helpers who'd be counting you all the time, giving you your laps. And I'd be slightly confused when had just done my evening laps and they were telling me the afternoon laps. And then I realized, of course, this is a completely personal, inner, subjective kind of experience. But for me, it really worked. And for me, I think it's also the key. It's about stamping that individual, personal idea onto this really very difficult, very long, frightening distance or time, which is what these events are. And we may be talking about marathon here or half marathon. These are still long events. I think ultra typically does mean longer than marathon, but I think this really can apply to anything. Okay, so just 1 or 2 minutes. I'm just going to sum up and try and draw this together. I hope it's not been too garbled. So these two things seem like very small things, but they do have a huge impact, I found. And I think the first key thing would be about step-by-step process. The meditation gives you the inspiration and I think perhaps the imagination to come up with your own step-by-step process. And that's going to be different, I think, for everyone. I'm just giving you some ideas from my slightly mad way of doing things. So step by step, and that can be a few simple steps. But as you can see, when I was trying to describe these loops, that can become quite complicated. Each step in itself can be made up of more steps. And the meditation, what it does, it gives you the strength, I think, just to focus on the step you're on, that particular day, that hour, that half-hour stretch, whatever it is, just to allow yourself to only focus on that, not to worry about the previous ones, not to get too caught up worrying about what's coming up in the future, in the next day, or whatever it might be in the next hour. That can be just too much of a burden for the mind, too frightening in a way. So step by step. And then I would say allow yourself to be interested and intrigued by the way that meditation, as you practice it, allows you to see that these things, these inner capacities, you like, things like determination, willpower, particularly something like patience. We never go out and train patience. We go out and say, right, I've got to run 5 miles and I've got to do it at a certain time. We don't go out and say, well, one thing I need for these races is patience. How can I actually go and learn that? Allow yourself to feel that meditation can teach you those things you like. They're not mere sort of dictionary terms or dry linguistic terms. They're actually real living kind of entities, if you like, that you can slowly develop. A bit like a muscle that you can slowly develop day by day. And for me, I think that was the key. That was a realization with in the 10-day race, doing these later laps. during the part of the day where I was fresher and my mind was fresher. Somehow those later laps, although they're part of the same stuff, if you like, they're part of this mathematical, mechanical, slightly frightening, dull, dry part of life, through the meditation, through that way of feeling and experiencing, they had a different quality to me. They had a different energy, if you like. They had a reality to them that was subtly different from the other laps, even though, of course, outwardly we're talking about exactly the same thing. And I think, looking back, it's only through meditational practice that was able to emerge for me. So step by step, allow those things to happen. And I think just be curious about this inner clock, this inner timing. That's, if you can stamp your own individuality onto the thing, it's not something that's in control of you. You've got to take control and just very, very slowly steal a march on it and impose your own individuality, what that might be on it. And I think that often will boil down to that inner clock. There's something ticking away there. And when it's yours, it's subjective and you're in control of it. And it's no longer such a daunting, frightening kind of thing as some of these distances can be if you just go through the sort of rather dry, mechanical, mental approach. So we've come up to 25 minutes. It would be great to get a few questions or comments. It's more or less everything I want to say. So let me just see. Scroll down. Thank you for channel info. Always important. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything in particular at the moment, question-wise. I'm not sure if that's because people aren't inspired or possibly no one's watching, or maybe the chat isn't actually working. I don't know. Anyway, no problems. Great. Well, someone's asking, where are we? When is your next swim? Well, just in the last few minutes remaining. I was hoping to do a channel swim this year, actually, and it got later and later, and it was stormier and stormier. And then I realized that the latest ever channel swim on record was the 3rd of November. And because I've been, as I said, I've been living in quite a remote place down in Cornwall, and I've been training every day in the sea for quite a few months. And I thought, well, if anyone could do this, maybe it's me. And so I really started thinking quite seriously about it. But of course, the weather just never got good enough. And then I think that within the next day, the lockdown started, and there was a whole complication with whether swimming in the channel would count as essential or not. So it wasn't possible this year, but hopefully next year. What's my favorite training food? Okay, so, you know, I planned all sorts of things to say, but I really never planned an answer to that. So you completely stumped me there. But it's funny actually, because sometimes before these events, you get super healthy and you cut out all the sugar and everything, and then the day the event starts, you've just done your 40, 50 miles, and the cooks and the organizers bring out this fantastic food, and you just dive into every single cake and creamy thing you can imagine. So everything falls apart pretty quickly. Part of the inner clock and patience, very inspiring. Yeah, I think the, you know, scientifically there's inner clocks, and nature's full of these extraordinary clocks and living beings that are able to respond to very specific timings. But I do find that part of you, while you're doing these things, is trying to not think about time and distance, but at the same time there is part of you that's counting away, I think, like anything. And I think that's not a bad thing. I mean, you can try and get that out of your mind if you want, but I think it's also quite a positive thing. Because, as I said, that's more your subjective inner state, which again I think meditation helps you enter into. And I think that part of you is beneficial. It's definitely a step away from this very dry, difficult mental approach, which is just counting the miles and looking at the distance and only going about it like that. Let's just see here. How do you keep going when things get worse? When things become worse? Yeah. So again, I found certainly with the channel, I would struggle like anything sometimes quite early on, after about 2 or 3 hours, having trained through that distance many, many times. And I think it's after about my third or fourth go, I started to realize that this was just a specific little phase that almost always came up, and it would never last that long. And it would really be like a bit like a fever. When you have a fever, you feel very ill and uncomfortable, but sometimes 20 minutes later or half an hour later, you can feel suddenly much better, and the thing can pass very quickly. So I used to just, again, with this step by step thing, I'd say to myself, right, fine, I'm just in this phase now for 20 minutes, half an hour. I'll just let it run, and almost always it would disappear again. I think also coming back to that, the when I'm sort of persuading my mind to continue through those difficult patches, throughout all that training, my approach was to always allow myself what I think of as an out, i.e., I'm going to go and try and do a 6-hour swim tomorrow morning. But I say to myself, look, if you're really not up to it, or something goes wrong, just be happy with an hour. Or if I'm going to try and do 6 miles in the pool, I'd say, look, if you get up to 3 miles, fine, don't worry, just go home and try another day. And I think my personality, I'm quite lazy, but when I get going on something, I'm quite determined. So for me, that helps me get through it, because I know that I kind of don't have to do it, but actually underneath, I know I will. And that may not be everyone's way of approaching things, but that I'd always have that way out of things that says, well, you can stop early. And that's really how I got through those 6 hours. After 2 hours, if I was really miserable, I'd say, I'd say to myself, just try and go on for another 5 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. And usually coming back to that point about the fever, it would just evaporate. And also another thing is that sometimes after a couple of hours, you'd start to feel really quite euphoric, quite exhilarated, and almost all the problems would sometimes just disappear. And in fact, all these techniques and structures I'm talking about that you need to try and put in place, in a way, then they just fall away. You don't really need them anymore. You know that you've sort of overcome that main hurdle, if you like, and it's just plain sailing after that. So that definitely says there's always, you're going to come across those moments of really difficult points in any. In fact, it's almost the whole point of doing the ultra. Everyone will go through it, and sometimes you can just say to yourself, just say, right, come on, I'm waiting for you, I'm expecting you, sometime today it's going to happen, and just get yourself ready for it. I think we've got time for maybe one more comment or question. If I can get my scroll to work. Will I swim the channel again? This is always the inevitable. And yeah, I do want to try and do it another couple of times. And again, I think it's this, whenever I do these things, there's always this part of me that says, just no. And it's almost like part of me comes up and says, why don't you just sign a form that says to people to stop you doing it? And then always there's just this urge to keep going and want to do more. And I think, again, it's the mind versus the heart. You do those events, and almost everyone does them, and they say never again. They want to stop. Pretty much everyone who does them, by the time they finish, they're already planning the next event or the next challenge. And I think that's, again, the meditation is the heart speaking. It gets tremendous joy and tremendous thrill from doing these things. The mind, on the other hand, is just a tricky beast. And that's why we love to do meditation, enter into that part of yourself. And, don't denigrate the mind. It's very useful. We need it for a lot of our life, but be aware there's this other part of ourselves. Okay, so I think that's us coming out just over half an hour. So I will end there. Thanks very much, and hopefully see you again soon. Bye for now.